Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Underground podcast. It's been a while. For that, I do apologize. Sometimes things happen, and that's kind of what's been going on with me. And I just wanted to say thanks for being patient for this new episode, and also welcome to our new format. As you can see, things are a little different around here in that for the moment I'm sitting here by myself, and most of these episodes are now going to be just me. But if you're here for NATO, don't despair, because he will be up later in the episode for the Ask NATO Riley segment of the Cloud Underground podcast. So that's coming. Stay tuned, and NATO will be here very soon. As always, I am Laura, and this is the Cloud Underground podcast. So as usual, we're going to start off the episode talking about a few news articles. And, you know me and us here at the Cloud Underground podcast, we always like to talk about shifts in the job market and how things have changed, particularly since 2020 and people working from home during the pandemic, and how this has changed the workforce and how people are working in general. So, of course, this time I'm again talking about this whole concept of the Great Resignation. And so let's dive in a little bit. Let's talk about what is the Great Resignation and why it's happening. There's lower wages at jobs, higher risk. As an employee, going to work during the pandemic is just inherently risky to yourself because you might get sick from all of the people that you're around, especially if you're working in a service industry job. And because there's less people working, as people are quitting, that means that the people who are staying in those jobs have a greater workload than ever before. Somebody has to shoulder that extra burden, and usually it's the people who are just currently working in those positions. And also, a lot of people and unions are going on strike. Labor strikes are causing this month to be referred to as Striketober. I saw a video of a Kellogg worker talking about this, because Kellogg workers are, as of recording this, still on strike. And one of the things that really resonated with me that I saw one employee say in a video, I'll be, of course, linking all of this information in the description of this video. But one thing one person essentially said was a year ago they were saying that we were essential workers, we were heroes for coming to work every day and continuing to produce food or whatever on these factory lines. And now they're saying it's essentially time for these companies to be giving their employees a fair deal. And that's not what's happening. And so that's why people are striking. Other labor unions that are going on strike are the IATSE, which is the union that is a big Hollywood union. It's the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. So it's kind of all the people working behind the scenes, from what I gather. They had been threatening to go on strike for the first time in their whole 128-year history or whatever. And they actually did reach a deal and will not be going on strike because they were able to essentially negotiate out of that. But even internationally, there are a lot of labor forces striking in New Zealand, in Paris, in India. It's happening all over the world. By the numbers, in each month from April to August of 2021, 2.5% of the workforce quit. In August, that amounted to 4.2 million people. And that's, 10 to 15 times higher than what we were seeing in 2019, which was a record-setting year for job turnover to begin with. And essentially, it's, now it's a workers' market. They can finally be making these demands because businesses need them, because there just aren't enough people filling these jobs. So, right now it's the power is in the hands of workers because there just aren't enough of them. And then, leading into this also, another thing that's contributing to people like quitting their jobs and leaving the market is a burnout, or, seeking new opportunities, essentially is burnout. I thought it was interesting. A company called McKinsey & Co. did a report that found that 35% of men and 42% of women said that they were burnt out often or almost always. And like I see that a lot in my own life, or with my colleagues, with people around me that I'm close to. It's like burnout is a real problem, and it just comes from being overworked, and also I think often they say that a lot of doctors are burnt out, that people particularly in like the medical fields are burnt out. I think it also is common in startup culture because there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is a huge factor in burnout. And it's like there's always this mentality to be like, oh, you should go meditate or whatever, like as an employee, like if you could just go and like get into a better headspace or whatever, you'll feel less burnt out and everything will be better. And yeah, of course, mindfulness and all of these things can help. But you can't put all of the pressure of like solving burnout on the employee, which is traditionally what happens. The job stress itself is not managed. And if the job stress is not managed, then it's going to continue to be there and be putting pressure on these poor people and contributing to them being burnt out. And now, once again, because of this whole idea of like this Great Resignation, and employees really having more power all of a sudden because there just aren't enough people willing and able to do these jobs, employers are finally starting to listen. And some tech companies, a few even, closed for a week over the summer, essentially to combat burnout, to give everyone a week off, that they wouldn't be coming back like swamped with, a million emails that they weren't able to answer during their week-long vacation or whatever. Other companies like Fidelity Investment is piloting a program where employees work 30 hours per week, and seeing how that goes, which the only problem with that is they're paying people less. They're saying, all right, if you'll work 30 hours a week, we'll pay you less, but we'll give you full benefits. But which is kind of, I don't know, they're going to find, I imagine, I hope and presume, and from what I understand of, productivity, they're going to find that those people working 30 hours a week are probably just as much or more productive than people working 40 plus hours a week. But of course, they're like, oh, you're working less, so we're going to pay you less, which is whatever, another issue altogether. But it is still a good concept of like, let's have people work a little less and maybe they'll be less burnt out, because I do think that that's valid. And sorry, my light's doing crazy things. As I was saying, I lived in Europe for a short period of time, and a 30-hour work week is very common in a lot of European countries because people value their free time. People care about spending more time with their families. Nobody wants to be like stuck at work in the office all of the time. Some other companies like Highwire PR are trying to scale back on meetings, which is another thing that I think is actually like a really good idea. I think way too many companies have people spending way too much time in meetings. If you're meeting twice a day, you're like way overdoing it. If you're meeting once a day, you're way overdoing it. If your employees are going to meetings, definitely if they're going to meetings more than once a day, then you're losing so much productivity, because every time they have to shift tasks to do something else, like then you're losing at least like 30 minutes to an hour of somebody's attentive time, because it takes time for you to shift your attention from one thing to the next. It takes time for your brain to refocus from one task to another. So the more meetings they're in, the more time you're disrupting that like focus or like flow state, and the more productivity you're going to lose. So of any of these things, I think that's a huge one. Yeah, definitely spend less time in meetings. HubSpot, for example, eliminated all Friday meetings, which I think is, even if that's just like 20% of meetings, that's awesome. But anyway, for a lot of people who, slapping these band-aids on the problem is not necessarily like addressing the company culture that's like contributing to these feelings in the first place. And, for a lot of people who are able, and obviously not everyone is able to do this, but for a lot of people, this feeling of burnout, the uncertainty that came with the pandemic of like what's going to happen with my job in the first place, which again, like I said before, that uncertainty contributes to the burnout. For many people, the answer was to just quit their jobs and move on. And then, of course, the other side to this is how can businesses manage burnout? How can you prevent your employees from getting burnt out? According to one burnout expert, there are 6 things that companies can do to kind of alleviate burnout, some systemic things that they can do. They can create more manageable workloads. They can give employees control over their jobs as much as possible. They should be rewarding and acknowledging good work, preferably financially, but at least verbally telling people that they're doing a good job. They should be fostering community. That's always good. Feeling part of the team always makes people feel more motivated. And they should be treating workers fairly and equitably. Another like sort of no-brainer. If you, everyone should be treated equally, no matter if you're a man or a woman or what race you are or what religion. It shouldn't matter. And they should also be helping workers find value in their work. That one, I guess, I feel like is a little harder. It's like a little more intangible. Workers have to kind of find that value in their work, I think, themselves to a certain extent. But I think having all of the other 5 things will help contribute to something like that. And then if you're to the point where you're trying to prioritize, like, okay, so like what can we do to like help create a better work environment? I mean, a simple solution is like ask the people who are working for you. Like, no brainer. Just have the conversation. Ask them. Things that are often said, especially right now, or especially during the pandemic, during lockdown, when there were so many parents that were like home with their kids and their kids weren't in school, supporting working parents was a big thing that was coming up. Of course, supporting mental health. I think that's becoming hopefully less and less stigmatized. So like, let's talk about mental health problems and like how difficult it is, to be living in these trying times. And then of course, like, don't just try and throw a band-aid on the problem. Try and actually like listen and make informed and viable solutions. Sometimes big change occurs in small ways. So, and then of course, like a few tangible things that you can do if you're a manager in like a service industry is like let people choose their own breaks when possible and let them input how their shifts are scheduled and that sort of thing. And ultimately change has to be implemented from the top down. So it's like if leadership doesn't care and isn't doing anything to help the people, the people on the very bottom of the pay scale, then of course, like, it's going to be not great for anyone. And another positive that comes from all of this is that even for those people who, can't necessarily afford to quit their jobs and find something better, who like need that paycheck no matter what, and it's like, if you are an essential worker or you are doing something that you feel is important, this whole idea of the Great Resignation can benefit you in other ways, which, mean just essentially because now you're able to negotiate in ways that you never necessarily have been able to before. So take advantage of the times that we're living in and, go to your boss and tell them what they can do to like make your experience better. And hopefully, especially if you're one of the few people who are like the hangers on or have been like loyal to the company, they'll be more likely to listen. So turn the job you have into the job you want. And now let's talk about something completely different. I am starting more and more to learn about coding and languages and that sort of thing. I've always been pretty familiar with HTML and Java scripting from like back in the day. I am slowly learning more CSS, but anyway, I'm trying to get more in the coding sphere and learn more about coding in general. So anyway, I came across this fun article that was about the history of C language. C, of course, is super prominent, but it's kind of a dinosaur among coding languages. It's been around since 1971, which in the world of computers is forever. Unix is written on it, making Mac OS, iOS, Linux, Android, Chrome OS all possible, and those are just, a few of the big hitters. And of course, a lot of databases are also written in C, so... but this language, which is like so important to so much coding and so much of what like our compute is written on, is it's got a storied and complicated history. And it all kind of starts with this guy, Christopher Strachey, who was a Cambridge-trained scientist, but who was at the time teaching at high school. He also happened to be friends with Alan Turing, so that helps as well. Well, Burton's National Physical Laboratory got one of Alan Turing's first automatic computing engines, which they called the Pilot Ace. And Strachey ended up being able to spend a lot of time on this machine during his summer break, essentially, and decided he wanted to teach this computer how to play checkers. So he was writing this program to teach the Pilot Ace how to play checkers. But, of course, this program, which couldn't have been that complicated, right? By today's standards, it was too big for the computer's internal storage. So it didn't really work out on the Pilot Ace. But with the help of his old friend Alan Turing, he was able to get this program running on a slightly beefier machine. And this program that he wrote, teaching this computer how to play checkers, was such a big deal that the British government actually called him up and asked him to help out their computer science team. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, there was this group of researchers, 3 of them, who all happened to be named David. They were writing a new language to run on a new computer system for Cambridge University. They wanted to write a new OS, but in order to do that, they were like, oh, let's just write a new language, too. And so they wrote Cambridge Program Language, CPL. Basically because they thought they could come up with a better operating system and language than what other computers at the time were running. At some point, Christopher Strachey joined this project, and but as often the case when somebody comes on board and is super enthusiastic and super excited, he had a million ideas, and he honestly just had too many ideas, and his inability to focus created this really bloated and complicated language system. So the Cambridge programming language quickly became Christopher's programming language, and it was just this big mess. Eventually, Strachey went to do a residency at MIT, and while he was away, the other Cambridge scientists dove into the task of simplifying this CPL. All they wanted was a good compiler and something that would produce efficient code. So they called it Basic CPL, or BCPL, but it sucked still because it was too large to run on any of their systems. So in comes this guy named Ken Thompson. Ken Thompson developed Unix. He broke BCPL down into just the features that he thought were most important, and he called it B language. Now, someone else took B, and they added some new features, and they ended up calling that newbie or NB. And eventually Thompson came back around, and he wanted to use NB, but it still wouldn't work for what he wanted it to do, which was essentially just to write Unix. So he added on feature by feature until he eventually created a whole new language. And thus, C was born. Because C was largely used in university systems and in academic settings at the time, and most people who used computers were students in those settings, C really ended up taking off. And these students who graduated from college, got a good working knowledge of the system, and then they took it out into the real world and spread it across industries and systems. And it is still a nimble and widely used language to this day. For our last item of today, we're going to talk about something that I've been learning a lot about because it is tied to our main story of the day, which is the chip shortage, which isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about supply chain issues, which is something else that I have been researching a lot over the last week. So basically, what is this? If you've gone to the store and tried to buy something like toilet paper and there wasn't any on the shelf, supply chain issues. If you ordered a package and it shipped from China and it was supposed to be here in 3 weeks and instead it took 3 months, supply chain issues. And of course, this is all somewhat driven by the current climate of e-commerce. All of this, everything that we're talking about today, I feel like, is all related to the pandemic because so much has happened and so much has changed since the world was kind of pushed into this crazy time by coronavirus. And so what happened, of course? So COVID hit, and people who were typically able to spend money on experiences, going out to restaurants or concerts or going to shows, whatever it may be, taking vacations, going on trips, all of a sudden they weren't able to do those things. But they still had all this money and they wanted to buy stuff. So this had a huge impact on the kind of delicate infrastructure chains that exist globally to get products from one side of the planet to your doorstep. The crap you buy gets packed onto shipping containers wherever it is, not necessarily in the country of origin, but at the closest port. And then suddenly the amount of stuff we were all buying increased 20% from 2019 to 2020. And this caused a lot of congestion in the process. Part of this is because things like port capacity, they don't change overnight. So just because all of a sudden 20% more stuff is coming through the ports, the ports aren't 20% bigger. And then of course, with COVID came worker shortages, based on things like we were just talking about, and also, workplace restrictions. All of a sudden, you couldn't have too many people gathered together or everyone was going to get sick. And you had to think about, worker safety because people did get sick and, things were shut down and everyone had to quarantine and it was this big mess. And so suddenly there are ships that are backed up waiting to get through the ports, to get unloaded onto trucks, to come to your, doorstep or whatever. Trucks, trains, whatever. Freightos, which is an online marketplace, says that ocean freight from Asia to the U.S. takes 69 days currently, right now, which is twice as long as that number took in 2020. So in 2020, it took your stuff 35 days to get here. Now it takes nearly 70. It also costs 3 times more what it cost before to ship a container. Obviously, everything that doesn't say made in the U.S. is most likely coming through some sort of port. 80% of global trade is carried by cargo ships across the ocean, which is crazy. That's so much stuff. And of course, something like that has huge implications for our economy and our society. And the federal government, of course, is paying attention to these things. And this caused Biden to issue this executive order that we should try and attempt to manufacture critical items in the U.S. But all of this congestion, of course, came after this sharp decline. As soon as COVID hit, all of the disruptions in factories overseas that caused, factories to be shut down, that really halted production and manufacturing of goods. In April of 2020, imports of items dropped significantly, but then they have bounced back as people spend less money on services and more money on goods. And of course, marine terminals have a finite amount of space, as do, shipping yards for trains, for trucking, all of these things. You have to have space to store the containers before they get loaded, as they get offloaded from the ships and then unloaded onto the truck or the train or whatever. And everyone was running out of space. 40% of goods from overseas end up on trains. And in June, the backlog was so great that the Union Pacific Railroad suspended service from Chicago to the West Coast for a full week to try and take care of the backlog of excess goods. The flip side of that is that it was actually good for for companies that rely on air freight. So while passenger planes maybe weren't as full, they were actually fuller with air freight, with just, random goods that are now being shipped through the air instead of over land. And so that helped alleviate a little bit of this backlog. And even though consumer spending is beginning to drop back down, some ports are predicting that these backups could continue to be an issue through 2022, which will definitely result in some empty shelves around the holidays. So do your Christmas shopping now, because what you want might not be available. We're going to talk more about some of that and some of the supply chain problems that are coming from the chip shortage coming up next as our main topic of the day. The moral of this story is that when you click buy, when you go online, when you shop for something, crap doesn't just magically appear at your door. For example, I have a friend who was visiting me a few weeks ago, and she was telling me how she and her husband were trying to buy a new coffee maker. And they found one that they really liked. It had a drip coffee for her and an espresso machine for him, and they were both really happy and excited for this new coffee maker. It was supposed to arrive in a few weeks, and it shipped, and then it just got stuck. There was no updates. And they're like calling the company, what's happening with this coffee maker? And turns out it was just stuck in a ship waiting to get into a port, but there was no space for this ship. And it was just stuck for weeks in the middle of the ocean or on the edge of the ocean, just waiting to get unloaded so that it could get shipped to their door. It's not simple. It's a complex system that is easily disrupted. You remember when there was one single ship that blocked the Suez Canal and screwed everything up in global trade for a whole week? Well, get ready to continue to stockpile your favorite items and toilet paper, at least for another year, because it's probably going to continue to be like this. All right, so our main topic of the pod today, we are talking about the global chip shortage. I'm not going to go too crazy into this because I feel like everyone knows that it's happening, especially if you've tried to purchase a car or a PlayStation 5 or, a graphics card or any sort of consumer electronic device in the last year and a half, then you've probably run into this to a certain extent. So you are aware that it's happening. So we're just going to do a quick breakdown of why it's happening, how long we think it's going to be occurring, and, just some more general information. And why is this relevant? Well, because we all know that it's happening. But now it turns out this microchip shortage may end up sticking around much longer than anyone anticipated. So what happened in the first place? I think you have to think of microchips as the new oil, and it's like this really important resource that so many things are reliant upon, especially in this digital day and age. Factories for microchips are primarily based in Korea and Taiwan. Like everything else that we've talked about today, COVID had a huge impact. When the global pandemic occurred, many factories were shut down. Like, as we talked about before, with supply chain impacts, ports were shut down. And then as ports were reopened, these crazy bottlenecks were occurring. There's a shortage on employees and all of these things. And all of that, made things more complicated. And then, of course, also in the face of COVID, like we were talking about before, there was this sort of uncertainty. Nobody really knew what was going to happen, especially early on. And so many companies ended up canceling their chip orders, particularly auto manufacturers were canceling their orders for microchips because they assumed the economy would crumble and nobody would be able to afford a car in 2020 or 2021. Well, it turns out that's not exactly what happened. The demand is high right now, but a lot of these companies, due to the fact that auto manufacturers were changing their demand, ended up retooling their plants to make consumer-grade electronics instead. So that really helped impact the auto chip shortage. So the main industries, like I've already kind of touched on, that are impacted by this whole shortage are the industry. Used car prices have been soaring. Demand for used cars are soaring. If you have a used car sitting around, maybe now is the time to offload it because we can't get new cars, so used cars are becoming a lot more valuable than ever before. There used to be this idea that like you drove the car off the lot and it would drop by like 50% or something. The value would drop by 50%. That's not even the case anymore. Not right now, just because of the market and the way things are going. And in Q3 of this year, vehicle sales have fell by 30% as the chip shortage reduced available inventory. Even though, like we discussed before, demand is high. U.S. manufacturers will be making 1 to 1.5 million fewer vehicles this year. Though there are people like Elon Musk, who is the constant optimist, who says that this is only short term. We'll see about that. I mean, so far it's been pretty long term, and most people are saying that it's going to last into at least 2022. Another industry that's been really impacted by this is consumer electronics. You want to get a PS5 or an Xbox at MSRP, or even just a graphics card for your computer, like, good luck. Will you ever get that PS5? Probably not this Christmas. Good luck. Part of this, again, is because of manufacturing. China has shut down production in the last month or so to a lot of its major plants to reduce emissions and energy use. China is suddenly ultra aware of like global warming and climate change. I mean, good. This is all good things, but it has major impacts on companies that rely on those plants for parts. A lot of those companies include Intel, Qualcomm, Apple, Nvidia. They rely on Chinese power plants, Chinese warehouses, and manufacturing centers to create these parts. And if those plants aren't running due to emissions reasons, then nobody's getting those chips. Also, Malaysia and Indonesia, where are other places where these plants are primarily based, have been forced to halt production due to COVID because of rising, Delta variant cases and this ongoing global pandemic that we're all still suffering from. Another thing that has really impacted the ability of these plants to produce is climate change. Renaissance in Japan, I might be totally butchering the pronunciation of that plant name. Renaissance, it creates a third of the car chips in the world, was severely damaged by fire in the past year. At the same time that winter storms were ravaging Texas, which caused the American chip plants to halt production. A lot of these plants are based in Texas, and when that power grid was like severely impacted by, these winter storms that it wasn't prepared to handle, that really impacted production. Also, drought in Taiwan has impacted production there. And speaking of Taiwan, which is one of the world's major chip manufacturers, as I said in the beginning, the threat of war between Taiwan and China is causing a lot of geopolitical pressure in that area. China wants to seize Taiwan, probably partly because the chip industry there contributes so much to that economy, and it's partly why maybe Taiwan might be able to resist some of these pressures from China, because they actually have a little bit of wealth. But that's another topic for another day, and probably something I should research a lot more before I talk about in any length. But all of these things contribute. Like we talked about before, increased demand for these consumer electronics, for cars, for all of these things has really, screwed up the supply chain, or has put a lot of pressure on the supply chain, which is kind of screwed up at the moment. And orders pile up as manufacturers struggle to keep up with demand. Ports are shutting down, costs are going up, and all of these things are just kind of snowballing on top of each other and making this whole chip thing even harder on the average consumer or small business or whoever that's just trying to exist while these things are going on. So how long do we anticipate these things are going to last? I mean, at least until 2022 and possibly even longer. A lot of companies are opening new plants, but that takes time. And likely these plants will not actually be online until 2023 to 2024. So, even though a lot of companies are investing a lot of money in chip manufacturing domestically as part of this whole push that Biden is making on make things in the USA or whatever, that still takes time. It's not like you flip a switch and there's a plant, opening tomorrow. It's a lot of planning, it's a lot of investment, and a lot of time to build these systems. So ultimately we ask ourselves, will anything ever go back to normal? I mean, maybe, if you're patient. But really a better way to look at it is that the new normal is not going to resemble the old normal. So we all just need to get used to it, get ready. Get ready to adapt and change, because the world is changing very quickly, as has been proven by the last 18 months. So there you go. This is another episode of the Cloud Underground podcast. Before we wrap up, I am going to send it over to Ask NATO, where we're going to ask NATO. Hi, NATO.
Hey.
So you've been talking a lot this week about NIST guidelines. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what these NIST draft regulations are?
Well, NIST is a mystery. But really, I guess beyond that. So NIST, if you ever wanted to know how, what are the things that companies have to follow when you get hired at them, and they're like, must follow these things, must follow those things. You go to the doctor's office, and then they hand you this form, and they're like, this is a HIPAA document. And they say, sign these things. All of that stuff is basically things that, while I'm oversimplifying the concept, is born from NIST. So even how your healthcare is managed, all that good stuff, the foundations of how to protect that and secure that all come down from NIST. So what we are going to be doing is, now that new technologies are coming out, of course, since NIST cares about how things get secured and how data gets managed, and then provides standardized ways that essentially say, as soon as companies become more corporate, more enterprise, the larger they get, they have no choice but to follow a lot of these designs and concepts and guidelines provided by NIST. And so really, NIST is what sort of defines most of the world's regulation and standards and standard practices for things like security. And right now we're doing it for cloud native service meshes.
So is NIST an organization then?
Yeah, it stands for National Institute or Institution of Standards and Technology or something along those lines. That's what NIST is.
So tell me about the event that you'll be hosting on Saturday for NIST guidelines.
So we're hosting an event, and for those watching this later, it's going to be recorded, so you can go back and watch the recorded information. But because there are new technologies coming out that haven't been receiving any global standards because they simply didn't exist until now, while a lot of the technologies that we were creating didn't really exist until the communities that we're involved in, including us, all gathered together to basically invent these new technologies. One of the big drivers and leaders of that is cloud native. Cloud native and cloud, while they sound the same, are actually not the same, which can be a little confusing. Because you hear people saying that cloud is dead, and then you hear other people saying cloud native is the future. And odd things about that is that they're separate things. So for the stream, because NIST now has created the world's first draft for these new technologies, which means that whatever NIST says, the rest of the world is generally going to say. Since we are contributors to this new technology space and contributors to the actual technologies that NIST is using, then what we are doing is a live stream where we're going to comment and provide feedback based on the research that we have directly with the community, the entire community, live, with the practitioners and from the dojo, everyone around our ecosystem who is able to join our commenting session. So basically, whatever we provide in our commenting based off of our research, everything, I will also be doing some showing actual things. So it's not just me talking about concepts. I'll actually try to show some of the concepts because we run an actual cloud native DevSecOps service mesh based cloud, which is what this new regulation's for. We're going to go and comment on the world's next regulation for DevSecOps cloud native service meshes. And then we're going to submit our research and comments over to NIST to contribute to defining the world standards for how all of the world's security and standardizations for these types of things work. It's the driest live stream you will ever see about legal documentation and regulation. It's not going to be that exciting, but it is important and it is world changing. So whether or not world changing things are exciting, it might be boring, but it'll change the world because there you go.
Still important.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Changing the world is more important than being excited, right?
Thanks, NATO. And of course, if you want to be a part of our NIST live stream, which will be happening on Saturday, please do go ahead and join our Facebook group, the Cloud Underground Engineers. You can sign up via the link in the description of this video. So go check that out. Become a part of our Facebook group where we do live streams every Friday. Even when the podcast occasionally goes on hiatus, you can always catch us there. So thanks for coming today. Thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for embracing our new format. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts on this episode, thoughts on anything we talked about today, please do leave your comments on this video and we will address them in future episodes of the Cloud Underground podcast. Thank you so much. Have a great day and we will talk to you next week.